So welcome to our concluding panel, the archival politics and infrastructure of Sudanese music. My name is Haneen Sidahmed, and I'm joined here by Alsarah Abunama-Elgadi. And we're going to be having a conversation just on the role of preserving Sudanese music history, and also from the perspective of, being a music practitioner, what that looks like, the role of nostalgia, the role of diaspora, and what heritage preservation means, especially in this context of war and loss. So I'm going to start off by introducing myself, introducing my work, and kind of walking you all through my journey. And I'll also have, a short little music sample to play. So my name is Haneen Sidahmed. I am a multidisciplinary artist, and I am a archivist or a DIY archivist. And I am the founder of the Sudan Tapes Archive. The Sudan Tapes Archive is an archival initiative that I started in 2020, and it's really dedicated to preserving the musical and sonic history of Sudan. And it's primarily through digitization of analog media, so primarily cassettes. So a lot of the media you will see on the Sudan Tapes Archive website or, the Instagram are all tapes that I digitized. I learned the labor, and I think one thing I will say about archiving is that it's a labor of love, and it's really tedious. So there has to be love in the mix. There has to be something that drives you to, sit and digitize and splice tracks and do all this stuff for hours. So before I kind of get into my journey, I would like to play a audio sample. And this is just a mashup of a song, which is also a poem. It's called Muzdar Abu Surah Al-Yanki. And the original poem is by the late Muhammad Taha Al-Gaddal. And it was sung again and compiled into a tape by the music group Ekdad Jalat. So I feel like this tape has a lot of resonance for me, and I would say was kind of like the beginning point of, yeah, like, okay. Oh, that's a sponge. Good to know. Yeah, it was given beatboxing. All right, okay. Let me turn it. Does this sound better? Yes, okay. You won't hear the P's. Okay. Great job. Um, yeah. Um, thank you. So yeah, I'm gonna just play the sample real quick, and it's a mashup of the poem, of the song. It may be a little faint, but I'm just, we'll just experience it together. واليانكي هو الامريكي وما في البيت بيحلق للجنة كفة وقدة كيف شوق اللبن والجنة حزن جاني فيما يعصيبه ينجيني اطلع مني يا جبل بنمي الجني واطلع مني يا حزن البقى جني خلني ابدا مصداري خلني ابدا مصداري وودي كفايه ميداني بقت ميداني جيت وجبت بينه وبين عرايا الشحر الا النار بقت قدامي جبت الليله بينه وبين عرايا الماء الا تراني شوال الكنس نتفيخ جراريب الورم الا تراني شوال الكنس نتبيخ جراريب الورم هدامي في جلد الورم بولدني ولا صح الورم عضاني سفريتك 100% ما هل كانت محرية خابرات الريف زم العربان ولا قيام الوردية مالك تريان مندي كاس الكتان والهندي قولك كيف ترجى البيشان ولا الغربة البزندي برقن عبدل الوزني يا طاش يا جاب المزني فرق يا الضيف مين في الدنيا ومين
أيام الوردية مين في النية ومين الكانت محلية مالك دريان ومندي كاس القدان والهندي قولك
All right. So again, that was a sample from the tape Musdar Surah. And again, this is a piece that has resonance to me and was actually how I learned to digitize music. So I learned how to digitize music, I think when I was 18 or 19. So this tape was gifted to my family sometime in the early 2000s. One of the trips we took to Sudan, my cousin gifted it to my mom on the way out. We were heading back to New York at the time. And uh, I love the tape. I didn't know what it meant. And even the language of Al-Gadal is very sophisticated and it calls, uses a lot of regional dialects. And I didn't really understand the thematic, resonance until I got older. So Muzdara Busurra Lilyanki is kind of this medley, and it really talks about the experiences of migration, of alienation, and really the psychic toll of leaving. So it starts off with Awaddi Gafaya Ledar and Bigamadari. So I leave, I turn my back to a home that is no longer my home, right? And that had resonance in the context of me just being a diaspora kid growing up, and it has resonance now as people are leaving their homes and their homes no longer belong to them and have been taken over. So I learned to digitize this tape just because I couldn't find like versions of the recording. I like finding the exact recording because I like reliving the exact nostalgic moment. I found this like $20 digitizer on Amazon. I ordered it and I recorded it on my laptop and I would listen to it on like my iPhone 5, going to school, going to campus. And I think it was something for my own listening pleasure and, it wasn't until several years later that I, um, you know, thought of doing this as part of a collective process of inviting people to the listening process and realizing that a lot of people also have similar nostalgic connections, right, to Sudanese music. And I think the whole process, the archival process, is driven by this diasporic sensibility of searching and seeking, right? And that's something that is just ingrained in the experience of everybody who grows far away from their homeland. And yeah, I think when I initially started the Sudan Tapes Archive and was just kind of uploading these like, low quality cuts of the music, I didn't think that people would take to it. And I saw it initially as um, I'm creating a library, creating a reference. It's digitization. I thought of it kind of as a really mechanical process, and I think I realized the value of the encounter. How these tapes also, I was providing an opportunity for people to really attach their own systems of meaning and memory, right? So there's an act of collective memory of remembrance embedded in the process. And I think I quickly realized that this was a archive that I would say is more of an affective archive, right? It's not kind of the archive as we understand it in the intellectual sense. It's not, I wasn't coming at the perspective of uh, there's a lot of from the intellectual or traditional sense of like looking at Sudanese music as an object of study, right? And it sometimes can reproduce a certain gaze, right? Especially, you see a lot of for example, Western world music enthusiasts, right? And they kind of engage with Sudanese music or, just music from the continent. And it replicates a certain gaze that has legacies of coloniality. And I think this one for me was different because it was a bottom-up archive. So even the collections, right, that I am digitizing or working with are private. Most of these tapes belong to my father, and a lot of these tapes belong to other aunties in the community that I grew up with that wanted me to take the tapes off their hand. And, they also wanted to listen to Anan Bulubulu, or they wanted to listen to whoever and recall their, days of being young and being in their prime. And it made me really think about the value of the archival process of something that is collective and communal. In a way, these people that I are contributing to my collections are co-curators, right? It's also a glimpse into their interiority and their experiences and their memories and conceptions of Sudan. And in a way, you kind of learn this yeah, I found that as I go through the process, I'm engaging with different versions and iterations of Sudan by virtue of the people. So I find that the archival processes, you cannot separate it from the people who, yeah, the co-curators, as I said. And I think it took me a while to really figure out what it was that this work was doing, because for a long time I was like, I'm just putting the tapes online and like I'm digitizing, and I couldn't grasp that there was a larger psychic, emotional impact. And I think I have to kind of go back and think about the idea of heritage institutions, right, and a heritage establishment, right. And I think that in Sudan there is not really you see the demise, right, of heritage institutions, and as mentioned earlier in the panels, we're now seeing that destruction, even tenfold, right, with the actual physical destruction of heritage sites. But even before, there's a widespread disenfranchisement of these institutions. You have a lot of DIY efforts, right, that are concentrated either in Sudan or in the diaspora. And I realized that the nature of heritage preservation in Sudan and where it really happens is not necessarily institutionalized. It's not to say we don't have archives or we don't have folks who are doing that thing in a formal capacity, or but I think that for me, as a person again who grew up in the diaspora, my cultural knowledge, my access to cultural production is honestly from Ammus on YouTube, who upload their recordings and their broadcasts from Sudan TV. You see a video, it's like Isam Muhammad Noor, and then he has the uploader has a big watermark, it's like an eagle, and it's Muhammad Salah Muhammad all over. So it's kind of like, these are to me the OG archivists. These are the DIY archivists. And I think like a lot of us might not conceive of ourselves as archivists, but ultimately these folks to me are the reason that I could even conceive of a project like the Sudan Tapes Archive. And I think that the DIY component of archiving really ties into I think the nature of Sudanese folks, the nature of everything we do is collective, it's decentralized, it's not, I think that there's, again, back to this component of, this process for me is very communal and relational. I think Sudanese people operate through the lens of collectivity, and that none of these things can be done or accomplished in silos. And I think that's another thing, right? In the world of like, again, Western music collectors, there's a big emphasis on hierarchy and exclusivity and getting a rare recording and hoarding it and keeping it. And I think this is the opposite of that. And I think, what this also is something that I would love to explore in the future is the value of Sudanese people seeing themselves as the stewards of their own heritage. And I think that the beautiful thing about technology, and I think it was mentioned in the previous panel, is the means of creation and the tools are more available. So like I mentioned, I started this project with a $20 digitizer that I got off of Amazon, right? So, you know, I'm sure folks here have family collections of tapes, or they have, you know, a box in a closet or a garage. These are things that folks can do at home. And I think the beautiful thing, and this is something Alsarah had said, is the beautiful thing about the diaspora is that you can know each other. And I think what she was getting at is the diaspora is this place where a lot of the structures that we operate in at home, right? I think they kind of rupture and fragment, right? So at the same time that there's this rupture, there's this opportunity for a very heterogeneous collective confluence of different types of Sudanese music, types of Sudanese culture. And I think when we democratize, right, like access to the archiving process, because everybody can do it, you know what I'm saying? We can kind of build an archive that actually might rewrite new narratives of what Sudanese culture is, right? And I think that we've seen a common theme here is that a lot of Sudanese culture and our conceptions of Sudan are kind of rooted in a certain central elite, right, or a certain cultural sensibility. You know, a lot of this is derived from whatever institutions are defining as good music and great music. And this is something I see in my own family, you know, like with the Amin and, you know, these folks who are considered the greats and the classics. There's also like so many amazing, you know, folks who have created music on the periphery. And I think again, the beautiful thing about a community-led archival process is that there's opportunities for us to reshape the narrative of like musical and sonic history. And I think the final thing for me before I pass it on to Alsarah is I started this project really initially with the intention of having something for folks like me, right? Folks who grew up in the diaspora. And I think I created it also with other diaspora kids who might not be able to speak Arabic or might not be able to, you know, do the Google searches on the niche forums to find this recording, and to just make it accessible and at the forefront and, you know, be mindful of what are the modern modes of music consumption. It's streaming, right? And I think this is a way of me paying homage to, again, the YouTube archivist uncles who made it possible for me to even cultivate an understanding of Sudanese culture and music and history and kind of replicate that for this generation moving forward. And I think the beautiful thing about being able to actually look to a past and being able to trace a musical history, a rhythmic history to kind of know yourself is that it actually breeds an opportunity for innovation. And I think when you're in the diaspora context, the nature of diaspora is this space of hybridity, it's the space of futurity. And I think a lot of us get stuck in this space of constantly looking to the past. It's really hard to create something new when you don't have a cohesive narrative of the past, right? And I think in the diaspora, we're always becoming and innovating, but there's this obviously void created by the ruptures and loss and, you know, of migration, right? So I think it's yeah, I think it's important for the youth to be able to have access. And, you know, there's a lot of diasporic youth who are doing things. I mean, I do this for, you know, nostalgic elders who want to listen to their favorite tunes. I also do it for like, you know, young kids who want to be SoundCloud rappers and want to like remix like Usman Hussein, and they want to do this, and you know they want to, you know, these are the folks I grew up with. I have little cousins in Oakland that want to be like rappers, and like I would love for them to have the opportunity to experiment like with Sudanese music and to like cultivate a sound or a diasporic sound. So I think that I yeah, it's a work that straddles the past and the present and is in this constant space of negotiating. And I think it's critical for all of us to be able to have a reference. And before I pass it off, I wanted to like just, you know, on these slides here. Again, this is a communal, it's a labor of love, it's an affective archive, you know, in intellectual terms, if you will. And, you know, I think this is rooted out of, you know, my family. My family immigrated to the Bay Area in the late 90s. 90s. And I experienced most of Sudan and most of Sudanese music and my cultural understanding, in the backdrop of al-ghurba, of the diaspora. And these tapes that I upload, I probably experienced them for the first time in like a Burlington Coat Factory parking lot. Like I think like that's where it was. It was playing out of, someone's 1998 Camry. Like this is the kind of like the space through which I got to know and understand Sudan and understand what it means. So again, an homage to my parents, and the postcard, from the Ghurba, sending it back home, the backdrop of the beautiful Bay Bridge, my entire family at the Old Country Buffet. I don't know if like it's a very popular Sudanese. It's not Sudanese restaurant. I just think Sudanese people love open buffets in America. So like, I like. So like that's where they all were, and like we would be in the parking lot, and they would love to like have a car door open, and they'd play like Gisma or somebody, and they kind of dance a little bit. So again, like this is my musical education. It was inherited and recreated right against this backdrop. And then on the next slide. And I also, this project has helped me reconnect and kind of also understand the lineage of where I come from. So on the left, I wanted to really give a tender and heartfelt thanks to Khalti Aziza. She is a dear family friend of mine. And on my last day in Sudan, a few months before the war, we went to Sudan Durman, initially for the mission of getting Nebak and Lalo for my mom to bring back home and smuggle, to the US. But I wanted to get tapes, and I knew that they were somewhere in Sugum Durman. And, the rickshaw driver went around with us for a bit, and we couldn't find him. And I kept telling her, it's okay, Khalta Aziz, like, let's go home. I don't want you to get tired. And she was like, no, I know it's on the east of the mosque. I know if we just go. And it was like, it's okay. I started feeling bad for the rickshaw driver. It's hot, and but she don't care. She's old. She'll tell him what to do. So like, she was like, go over there, go over there. And then I found the tapes. I actually found it, and I didn't believe that I was gonna find them, but I wouldn't have been able to kind of get my last batch without her. And I always think of her, and obviously, she's currently in Shendi right now, and it's someone I think about a lot when I'm archiving the tapes I got, the batch that I got with her. And on the right is my beloved family, my father's family in Medani in the early 2000s, and I think Medani has a beautiful musical history, and I think my father and my uncles are very they pride themselves on being from the musical, what they call the musical heartland, of Sudan, of the greats, of El Amin. And I know we'll challenge the canon later, but I think like them having passing down that penchant for music and yearning. And I think a lot of this is stuff I do with them in mind. And they're also still in Sudan, and we're displaced to Shamalia. And I think again, like I carry them with me. So again, this for me is very much a labor of love and of kinship and beauty. And I will pass it on to Alsarah to also just kind of share her story and what it's like to actually be making music and working with all types of Sudanese sound. And yeah.
Hi, everybody. Hello. So I never really learned how to use Zoom because I've never had a real job. Um, yeah, I'm super proud of that, to be honest. It's an accomplishment in today's capitalism. I'm lying. I totally have a real job. I'm a musician. So my name is Alsarah. I am the founder and band leader and songwriter for Alsarah and the Nubatones, also the producer. I'm also a trained and very reluctant ethnomusicologist. I'm gonna just dive right in. If you want to look me up, you can. You don't need to know much about me though. So let's talk about music. Yay! My journey with figuring out what the Sudanese sound was started when I first moved to the States. So, not to give away my age, but I moved to the States pre-YouTube. So I didn't really have any ammus uploading stuff. We just had what we had in the house, which, we came to the States, being evacuated from the middle of a war in Yemen at the time. So we didn't have anything with us. And I was trying to explain to people what Sudanese music was and sounded like. And so it was a very weird, unorganized process of just looking for things. Once we got our papers, I started going back to Sudan a lot to kind of look for stuff. I would go to Sudan. There used to be a shop there that had the tapes. So there was also tapes there, and I would go there. في Khartoum برضو, there was another spot that had those. But what really got me deep down into the dive is once I got to university, I decided to study ethnomusicology, which is basically the anthropology of music. And in it, I decided to do a thesis about Sudan, and there was no one at the time having any information for me in the States, so I went to Sudan. I went to the University of Khartoum to do my thesis research, the Center for Afro-Asian Studies, which is basically their version of the Ethnomusicology Center. This was supposed to be the spot that had all of the sounds of Sudan. That's their kind of their job. That was their job. So I went there to their library, and they only had 3 or 4 tapes from different regions of Sudan. Everything else was from Khartoum. And as someone who's also Nubian, I couldn't even find a lot of samples of Nubian music in Nubi. There was Nubian musicians like Wardi, who were part of the canon of the Khartoum Central Sound. So I knew immediately and intimately that not all of us were in this library. And I was like, okay, well, how many of us are there that are not in this library? Which led me to then the question of, how many of us are there here at all? I didn't actually have a concrete number on the numbers of tribes, the numbers of languages, the numbers of rhythms. I didn't have a concrete canon of anything. And when I went to the Mahad al-Musiqa wal-Masrah, which is the Conservatory of Music and Theater in Khartoum, the only formal institution for music studying, their library was also sadly lacking. There was a couple of descriptions of rhythms and nothing about scales, and everything was made in a way to kind of appeal to the Western idea of how music should be described. And that was also derived from a very bizarre conference that happened in 1932, where that's what created also the canon of the classical Arabic sound. And in that conference is when they brought people from Iraq, from Tunis, from wherever, and they put them all together, and they decided that they're going to create highbrow Arabic music. Sudanese people after our independence, wanted to be in that scene, in that particular scene of discussion. So they tried to create a highbrow orchestra sound. The creation of the maqam itself is a colonized thing. So when you start to also make another formula or another system that emulates a system that's already colonized, you're now looking at a third gaze at yourself. So we had nothing really descriptive in there. And supposedly back in the day, they would send people out of the Mahad for their final year to one region or another to do research. But that still meant that you had an entire generation of musicians that barely knew anything about the Sudanese sound. They only know about a very small amount of it. This was really confirmed to me when I went out to the Blue Nile, to Maban and the Nuba Mountains to work with Hajjoj Kukka on the documentary Beats of the Antonov. That was the first time I felt like I truly was beginning to get a scope of what Sudanese sound was like. It was outside of the world of Mustafa Sidahmed, the world of Wardi, the world of Muhammad Al-Amin, all people who are fine and lovely, but not the full story or even a fragment of the full story. So I'm going to play a little sample from the Blue Nile. This is a kind of music called chelak. Chalik. So the music is made by the whole community together. So this is truly communal music. The rhythmic sounds you're hearing is people stomping. The horn sound is made from like a pipe. This one was a CVC pipe from like an old tent, but usually it would be made from an animal horn or it would be made from a tree trunk of some kind. And this is traditional music that they have. But inside the same area, you've got musicians that are creating modern music that they write. So you have someone like Joda, for example, that I met when I was at the Yusuf Battle refugee camp. Joda, so they have, it's interesting because there I met the tiers of what it means to be an artist. There's players and then there's artists. And the difference was the capacity that made you an artist was the capacity to both memorize things as well as create new things, as well as build your own instruments from scratch, which is what Joda did. He made me a rababa in front of me in half an hour. From an old plate, an old lid, some like a slack that he pulled off of an old motorcycle brake handle. This is his song. So I'm not going to play the full song because it's really long. These are all field recordings that I recorded while I was in the camps, that I gathered personally. And this slightly auto-tuney sound you hear is him having taken a tape with like a radio tape player, and he reversed one of the speakers inside out so that it acts like a microphone and the other one acts like an amplifier. It was so creative and so radical. And I was just like, if we just mix this correctly, this is a banger. This is a club banger. And this for me really kind of reaffirmed as an artist the fact that we don't know much about our own stories. We do not know anything about ourselves. Our history has been really disjointed from every aspect, from the aspect of just learning facts about ourselves to the aspects of how we even approach our own culture, to this creation of the idea of highbrow music versus lowbrow music, the erasure of the folk sound, and the focus on a centralized sound that is institutional and difficult to achieve is really a huge part of this mental colonization that we've had around what makes us worthwhile in the world and in comparison. And as an artist, especially, this was problematic for me because I was trying to make music that represented me. And I realized I don't really fully know me either. And at the same time, making art in the diaspora, and at the same time trying to tell my own story while being pressured by people in the diaspora, especially Sudanese people, to represent their concept of nostalgia, and to how to really deal with that as an artist in the moment when you're trying to really, because it's important what they want and what they need, but as an artist it's also important for you to be representing what you want and what you need, especially when you know that what people are asking for is something frozen, something from a very specific romantic moment they have in their mind. It's not really a reality of today. And the more I go to Khartoum, I was going to Khartoum, the more I was going around Sudan, the more I realized there were so many other kinds of music, from Zenig to the modern day rap scene, to the wedding songs, to there's a huge wave of house music somehow popping up in like the southwest of Sudan, they love house music. And everything is being passed around in these Bluetooths and like on these USBs and on these SIM cards. And music is moving in its own network away from how we are consuming music in Khartoum and outside of Khartoum. And so how do you engage with that dynamic as an artist as well as an ethnomusicologist? For me, I'm still kind of navigating that space in between, you know, because it's a little bit of it's a little tricky, which is why I'm also deeply invested actually in amplifying as many different Sudanese musicians as possible. Because I think the problem we have is a real lack of representation, which puts a lot of pressure on whoever's out there to somehow represent the whole, which is so impossible. And no one who's not going through a real trauma would ever expect anyone to do that for them. So you can see that this is a place of pain and trauma, which is why I really love the fact that there is an archive project actually happening to help freeze those moments so that you can have access to them. You can have access to your past. It's important to have that. And I also really, really love and respect the world of YouTube archivists, as you call it. Naam was uploading stuff. Thank you guys so much. I do wish you would just put a little more detail in there, but I'm here for it. I'm here for it, you know? So for me, the conversation is still an ongoing one because the idea of archiving doesn't stop. You have to keep archiving forever because as people are alive, they are literal, like living archives. So with every human being, with every moment, you are creating new culture because culture is made up. It's made up by the people. It responds to the moment. It responds to the changes around it. That's its nature. And you only start to think that your culture is only one narrow thing when you are in moment of terror, in moments where you are truly worried about your capacity to continue existing. And that's why for me, it's also really important that we start to decolonize our concept of what Sudanese sound is as people in the diaspora, especially now as more and more of us are in the diaspora, it becomes more critical that we are really giving a full scope of the Sudanese-ness. Otherwise, we're going back into the same traps we had before. The sound of Khartoum is referred to outside of Khartoum as the post-1956 sound by everybody else out there because they're like, oh, that sound isn't our sound, it's just a sound from one area. So even when musicians come out from other areas and they're trying to record their music, they want to record something that they think will become popular. Because for the longest time, and I do mean for the longest time, until the late 90s, you couldn't record in Sudan. You needed to go outside of Sudan to record. And that meant you need to go to Egypt, or you need to go to Lebanon, or you need to go somewhere else. Egypt and Lebanon were the closest areas, and that was an invite-only thing. Just the same as with the radio stations and the TV stations, you have to be invited. You have to be deemed worthwhile. You have to be deemed respectable, Arab enough, Muslim enough, respectable enough. You know, if you dance too much, that's a big taboo. If you move too much, it's a big taboo. If you don't look right, if you look too black, it's a big taboo. And so this idea, and that has really, I think, stunted Sudan's capacity to document itself. And for me, like I was discussing with Haneen, the magic of the diaspora is being able to really get to know other people from different places, like you were saying, because a lot of these restrictions of archaic respectability politics and who's acceptable and who you can be with kind of dissolve a little bit. So recently, this past summer, I went to Kampala to work on a music residency. I designed and created a music residency as part of Sunduq, Sudan, to bring together Sudanese displaced musicians to exchange music. And this really also, again, highlighted to me the fact that we do not have any real knowledge of each other. I brought together 9 different musicians. We were having problems communicating words around rhythm. We were having problems communicating scales to each other. We were having problems figuring out how to tune things. And that's because we don't have a language of our own to describe our own thing. And we were still in 2 weeks able to come together and every person teach each other a song and do a concert of 18 tracks that we performed at Festival al-Shab, which you can still see on YouTube. The quality is not great. I did record those on multi-track, and I'm actively mixing them. So hopefully they will be able to come out at the end of the year as a full concert that represents the Blue Nile, that represents the Nuba Mountain, that represents different parts of Darfur, multiple areas in it. And hopefully it can lead us also towards a future where we are creating a new archiving language. I want us to move away from words like, if I'm going to be technical, words like pentatonic, which is often what's used to describe the Sudanese scale. Pentatonic just literally means 5 tones, which is 90% of the world's music. It doesn't mean anything. So how do we move towards that? How do we figure out what Nugara means in different regions of Sudan? Nugara literally just means rhythm or drum. So if you move around from spot to spot, that should look and sound different. How do we find words for that and create those canons together? And honestly, I feel like because everything is burning down to the ground in terms of our archives that we had there, it's kind of a golden opportunity to start from zero. Instead of having to correct an archive, we are building an archive from zero. So yeah, I think maybe I'll stop right there for a second. I don't know what time it is. 4:07. Yeah. Yeah. So I wanted to play actually one more song. Sorry. This is a song from a very popular musician, Captain Abbas, who lives in the Nuba Mountains.
Our daughter Jessie loves playing detective.
A clue.
But since we discovered she has sensitive skin, we've been playing
Sorry.
detective too.
My bad. So yeah, there in Kauda, there was a radio station there, and they would record a lot of the local musicians in the area, and they were very kind enough to share some recordings with me. So I'm gonna play this song from their archive. So yeah, I'm gonna stop it there. I don't know if he was playing the spoons because I wasn't there for the time of the recording, but it does sound like that to me. But I don't want to talk out of my butt. But it did sound like it, right? Now, I wanted to figure out what this rhythm is called, and no one could give me a name. So this is why I'm going back. So that's, I think, the essence of what I'm trying to say about Sudanese archives is that we don't have a real archive right now.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Alsarah. And I think I really wanted to revisit that moment of when we're faced with this sense of danger, or this sense that our heritage, our livelihoods, our very beings are in jeopardy, and the impetus to then freeze a moment in time. And I think that characterizes again, the diaspora component, but it's now more than ever, in the midst of this war. And I think that this kind of right destruction that we're facing, like you said, invites this opportunity for us to challenge like existing narratives. And I think again back to this element of putting the giving people the tools to become archivists, and kind of democratizing that access to the archival process. That's the beautiful thing, is that people can represent themselves, right? And with that comes an opportunity to break away from the normative musical kind of paradigms that we're seeing. And I think this is something I've encountered in my work, and that is something that I'm coming up against. I'm coming against, my own like limitations, right? My own the limitations of my my regional background, class background, my own idea and sensibility of what Sudanese music is. And I think it's critical for archiving to become participatory. And I think in the absence of institutions, I would, like you said, there really isn't an archive, and I don't really think institutions have ever been seen as like legitimate arbiters of like Sudanese heritage. I think like Sudanese people function through orality, and a lot of the stuff that we find out about Sudanese music is really vernacular knowledge or community knowledge. It's stories that somebody tells you, your uncle tells you about so and so. Like my father can tell me a certain drama between a singer here and a singer there back in like the 1970s. So a lot of this is inherited in what maybe the academy or formal music institutions might call like informal networks of knowledge. But I think that is actually our biggest strength as Sudanese people, is that the way that we process knowledge, that we generate knowledge, is relational and communal. And I think that this is like you said, a golden opportunity for us. And I think it shows, I mean, even in the story I told about me getting the tapes from Sugum Durman, when I came across those tapes, it was pretty much an abandoned building. It was all covered in dust and dirt. And at some point, this was probably like a bustling, location where folks were buying their tapes. And the majority of these tapes are actually, especially the ones that were still brand new, still covered, still in the original plastic wrapping, for probably goes back to the early 2000s. Most of these tapes are actually from artists from Darfur, from, the northern regions, from South Sudan, right? At some point, Sudanese music is, all these recording companies in secession Sudan also, where South Sudanese folks will go to record. So it was like you're seeing the hierarchy, and the canon literally be produced in the availability of the physical material. I could not find the people in the canon, whatever, Mahmoud Abdel Aziz, like all of these folks. But I'm seeing these things, and I can see that, the folks who have deemed certain things as disposable and certain things as heritage. And I think that was an opportunity for me to, take these tapes and again, enrich and expand, the curatorial process, because I think I have there's a sense of accountability as someone who's curating music, and as someone who's saying this is the Sudan Tapes Archive. I wasn't thinking of the scope, but I'm like, okay, Sudan is really big, and I'm one person, and I think like this is where I'm really like again appreciate like the this like space we're in, where there's a lot to generate. And I think it's really great that you get to like tap into these networks in Sudan, people passing things around with the flash drive. I remember like my last day in Sudan, coming out of I was about to go back home, and I was at Khartoum airport, and they found all these tapes, and they were just like, don't you know people use USB now? Like, why are you like, they were like, what are you doing? So but yeah, I think it's like there's when I was kind of talking about modern modes of music consumption, again, I'm really speaking from kind of like a first world context. And I think it's critical that folks are like doing the work of also getting to know the forms of, how this musical knowledge and heritage is produced and shared. So yeah, really appreciate that perspective.
I actually want to add and build off of what you're saying about our capacity to pass information orally in Sudan. And I agree with you, that is one of our biggest assets. While it does represent a danger of like what stories get omitted and why, there are genres of music that rely exclusively on oral traditions. So for me, like my first fascination with Sudanese music was with Aghani al-Banat, because even before I started to travel outside, I could recognize through my ear that this is a canon of music that has a huge variety of sounds and people coming in. And the power of Aghani al-Banat or Aghani al-Dalluka is that they get passed down orally, and there's hundreds and thousands of verses to every song, because it's almost considered like collective ownership. And it was also a music that would literally take things from any format that came to it and distill it into the Luka sounds. And you can find Aghani al-Banat everywhere you go in Sudan, everywhere, truly everywhere. So for me, it is one of the few things that I feel like represents all of Sudan and all of Sudanese sounds. That and Zenig. Zenig is also everywhere. It's amazing because you could do it anywhere. Also, it's so fun. I highly recommend the Zenig party, guys. But for me, that was my fascination with the Luka songs, is that you can literally watch the history. It's like you could, songs that are traditional songs from Nubia all of a sudden get distilled into the Luka sound because they became popular after Wardi did it. And then Hamid al-Rayh does a song, it gets distilled into the Luka sounds because they love it. They heard a song from Chad that they liked, it's coming into this canon. They heard a song from India they like, it is coming into this canon, and this kind of consistent updating and living without forgetting is part of that magic that I think is a big asset of coming from an oral history culture. So it's very important to gossip. That's all I'm saying.
Of course, yeah.
I'm not sure if I'm
Go
interrupting
ahead.
the
You're
flow,
not- you're
but
good.
okay, nice. I'll just join you guys. But I just had a question because one thing that I've been thinking about for a long time. I read something a few years ago that was like every time you remember something, the memory becomes distorted. Like you lose something, changes in it. And so, in this, you guys have talked about the pitfalls of nostalgia and how it sort of created these narratives about music and sort of like, these stories that flatten our histories but make us feel good. Like you aptly said yesterday, nostalgia is the heroine of all emotions, which I think is really true. So I'm wondering, like, in your guys' opinion, like what role does nostalgia play in preserving Sudanese culture and also in like how we relate to it?
I can go ahead. I can take a stab. I think like the function of nostalgia is really, I think it plays an important like psychic function in the sense that again, when you're grappling with trauma and you're grappling with displacement, and again, the fragmentation that kind of comes with leaving your homeland, whether it be through, whatever means. And I think that it's difficult. It's difficult to ground yourself. It's difficult to anchor yourself, especially when you are now in a context where all the terms and signifiers in the language around self-definition of who you are created by people who are not you. And I think something that I've found frustrated, also as an artist and whose, art is entwined with like my own archival work, right? That searching and seeking was I think partially a frustration with me trying to fit myself into whatever modes of representation were available to me, the languages of representation, whatever artists of color. Like I'm never gonna call myself that, but like so it's like for me it was critical to do that research, and some of it comes with nostalgia and some of it comes with romanticism. And I think that it's a good like departure point. I think nostalgia is an excellent departure point. I think it's a good energy to harness, especially in the creative process. And I think for me, the role of creativity in art, especially when, you know, as Sudanese people, we have so much grief, and so much of that grief is generational. It's an excellent way to transmute that grief, and you know, it's cathartic, it's healing in a lot of ways. So I think for me, the role of like nostalgia is emotional, it's psychic. And I think and a lot of, you know, art, you know, artistic movements like have come out of like nostalgia, and, you know, and a redefinition, and, you know, and it's kind of like we see this, like I see parallels, for example, like, you know, in Black America, and kind of like these moments of like uh looking to the past, like searching for a past, right? And obviously sometimes we can say, okay, are these narratives historically reductive? You know, like was everybody kings and queen? Like, you know, like that kind of. But at the end of the day, they were also generative moments, and like they were critical to like some of the most beautiful and collective and I think like historically significant artistic and musical moments. We see it in hip hop, we see it in film and everything. And I think like uh I think it's critical for a lot of diasporans who are navigating again this like this fragmentation, to be able to have that in some capacity. But I think the issue becomes when the nostalgia becomes like the ends and not the means to the end. That's when we fall into that reductionism, and this is something I've, you know, navigated in my own archival journey. I think before I was doing Sudan Tapes Archive, I ran a blog called Vintage Sudan, it was, I know, on the interwebs, and I was young, and, you know, I was going on these like Facebook forums, and it would just be these old, like, you know, vintage Khartoum like pictures. It's like, you know, these girls in Jamaat al-Khartoum, or then it's like President Aboud and John F. Kennedy. And, you know, at the time I was like, wow, like this is history, like this is it. Like, look, like we're like, we used to be a country, you know what I'm saying? And like, it took me time to be like, okay, first of all, we don't even like John F. Kennedy. And we don't even like Abu, like, you know what I'm saying? Like, no, like, I think, you know, that was the innocence of me being a teenager and grappling with like, I live in the suburbs of Northern California, and I'm like, you know, I just, you know, I'm figuring it out. But again, that without that nostalgic, that yearning, that seeking process, I wouldn't have been able to come to this point where I have the criticality and the understanding. And I think like you just the I think what I would say, again, back to this idea of like things being frozen in a moment of time. I think the nostalgia allows us to make somewhat of a coherent narrative of, you know, maybe our past, and it might be reductive and flattening in many ways. And I think that's like we all kind of participate that in some way. But I think I feel like I reached a point where I was able to depart from the nostalgia and start orienting myself in the present and future and in the creative process. And I think that's what a lot of like diasporans need, like just, and I'm talking about just young folks who are grappling with like identity, you know, issues and stuff. Like I think it's a good departure point. But once we, you know, it can't be the end all be all. It is absolutely the heroine of emotions.
Like a freestyle battle. No. Haneen, if you don't like the Aboud and JFK footage, then you'll definitely not like Turabi and Nimeri going to see Reagan and Bush. Like that was peak failure.
The worst people ever in a room.
Yeah. Well, thank you both. I mean, this has been a really rich conversation, and took us away a little bit from all the human rights violations and everything. I had to think on a deeper level. But I remember, yani, that period of the late 90s and early 2000s. Like, I had a friend of mine recently who started collecting all the tapes. And when you walk into the room, you see that all around just tapes. And like you said, from everywhere in Sudan. It was like the heyday of recording Sudanese music. in albums. I remember like, Mahmoud Abdelaziz is dropping an album. It was kind of like equivalent to Tupac, dropping an album here. Where the heck did all that go? The recording of the music, the albums, is that completely gone? Like, are we not gonna, and I'm sorry to sound panicky right now, but yeah, where is the music? Where do you look for it? Like, where is it being recorded? Is it being recorded? Is it being published? Yeah, I know there's a lot of like independent artists doing their thing. And like where's the body of work right now? Yeah, that's for both of you, since we're a little bit.
I can take the first. You can add if you want. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think what I came to know is a lot of the recording companies, the distribution companies that produce these tapes, a lot of them are like defunct, like they're no longer, and I tried to find it as a, process of me trying to source the work, reference, and a lot of them don't, they're not there, right? And or they've kind of shifted, to accommodate the new whatever modern forms of music consumption, and a lot of them are based outside of Sudan as well. I would say that, and I think this is a common issue in a lot of nations, like in the African continent, where there's this gap between the transition between the analog era of music, right, cassettes, records, whatever, and then the digital era, right. A lot of the to digitize and make available, your musical history, you need institutions that have the resources, have the funds, have the money. So for me, I would see that there's large swaths of music that haven't made that crossover. And for me, I just, again, I source these tapes from community members. Like, these are literally folks that I know. And I think it's, I don't think I can ever create an archive of like everything. And I think it's also the process of obtaining and sourcing those collections. It requires like relationships, right? It requires trust, because now these things, I mean, even before the war, like I think like people were hesitant to like part with their tape collections, even if they haven't listened to them in like 15 years. But I think like now it's like you need to like you need to and you need to build the relationships, and it's a slow process, and it requires you being kind of tapped into a community. But I mean, there's tapes all over the world, and I think like for me, my strategy is really to just like taking, merging, borrowing, like private collections from folks who are like just willing and generous. So again, it's a community bottom up kind of effort, and it's I'm sure there's other people who are doing it, and we're kind of taking on the role almost of like the institutions who would have helped make that crossover. But if you want to add anything.
Yeah, let me clarify some things from a technical perspective. When you record in the studio on tape, it's recorded on a physical tape, like a physical wheel, like back in the day when they used to make films on actual film. So until the early 2000s, a lot of these recordings are in actual masters. Usually whoever paid for the recording owns that master. Sometimes it's the artist, sometimes it's the label. Publishing back then was also sometimes folded into the label itself. A lot of artists, for example, also had their own masters with them. For example, and you can see that in a lot of the republishing work that's being done. So for example, my friends at Ostinato Records, when they wanted to get in touch with certain artists in Sudan, they would go, I would put I would help them get in touch with folks, and they would go and ask if the person has their own masters. Otherwise, it would end up with a label somewhere in a warehouse. A lot of the earlier recordings that were on vinyl and stuff were all owned by one guy. They all lived in, yeah. They were owned by one guy. It lived in his warehouse. He was kind of an ass to everyone and barely gave anyone anything. And I'm pretty sure it's burned now. Yeah, exactly. So you've got a few in the past 10 years, the republishing world sort of had a renaissance. So there was all of this grappling for, from collectors to small labels that just specialize in this, grappling for Sudani music because it was so hard to find. So some of them own those masters now too. TV stations and radio stations in Sudan owned almost all of the masters of anything that they recorded, and sometimes they would just give the artist a copy. So if those burnt, that stuff burned with it. Unless someone had digitized it, in which case then you've got a copy of the master, and you can digitize it and put it online, but there's very little tweaking you can do to it in terms of remastering, in terms of those kinds of things. The quality stays kind of lo-fi. But that's in fashion right now, so that's actually okay. So yeah, that's to answer yourself, you from a technical perspective.
There's, go ahead.
And also just thinking about, you brought this up a little bit about when I put it on the table, perhaps extreme or direct fashion, is that state archives are evil and violent in general, right? Regardless of where they are, they're usually colonial projects. But I'm also thinking about how, particularly with music from the non-Western world, right? It's not only part of the world music circulation, but there, as you just mentioned, all of these record companies that are so predatory in the West about the history of music from Ethiopia, from Congo, from Somalia, from Sudan, etc., and so on. So the work that both of you are doing in that regard is really, really important. Of course, it's also usually a very masculine domain, right?
Yes.
So thank you. My question really follows up on what you were just saying at the end, but it is for both of you. One of the things that becomes really clear when you look at the history of musical technology, sound technology, is that, like all technologies, it's never neutral, right? It's never objective. It has complete and utter limitations, right? So for instance, the technology of the MP3 was made by a German company in the 1990s, and what they used as a reference track, so to speak, was an a cappella recording by Suzanne Vega.
Yep.
From the 1990s. It's like a very sort of like clear voice, right? And there's no instrumentation, right? There is no distortion, there's no bass, there's no rhythm. So that's what sounds best on MP3, right? So my question for both of you is, what are the limitations of the technology that you have encountered? What can it capture and what can't it capture, right? Thinking about your origin story about the $20 digitizer from Amazon, I'm sure there are things, you know, beyond not having access to the master recordings, and also just note that name, right? Why are we still
using that?
But that is the literal technical term, right? So however you want to take it, and thank you again, both.
I can share about the kind of like the tapes component and like the limitations. So I mean, a lot of this has been me learning about music technology and kind of like becoming, I would just be on these like forums, like there's one called like Tape Heads, and you know, I had to, you know, I eventually graduated from the $20 recorder because I was like, okay, I do want like some nice high fidelity recordings. And part of my work is actually restoration of the audio, because a lot of these tapes have been, you know, locked away for years and they degrade over time. And that's the difficulty of analog material. So I think it took me a while, you know, sometimes I would overcorrect and it would sound really like, I don't know, like engineered and kind of like sterile. I think like that, you know, the MP3 sound or whatever. And then I think I've now met a place where I'm, you know, I'm correcting static or correcting, you know, where I need to, but also leaving like the warmth of like a tape. I think people really love that. They love, again, like the lo-fi, like kind of element. But yeah, I mean, another thing with Sudan specifically is like a lot of, there's not really like a consistent industry standard. So like, for example, if I'm getting tapes from like the US and I'm digitizing them, like I can see that there's a consistency across like the, you know, the waveforms, you know, there's like normalization, there's kind of like, you know, there's no clipping, but I think with tapes that I get from Sudan, some of them are like extremely loud and I have to, you know, use a device to kind of turn it down. Or sometimes it's really low and I have to turn it up and I have to bring certain things out. And it's also like interesting because when I was learning this process of like remastering and restoring, it's really designed for Western music, Western, and Sudanese music is so dynamic, and like sometimes the voice is actually, the vocals are not actually supposed to be the loudest thing, it's the instrumentation. And certain industry standard or conceptions of what a remaster should do, you know, actually conflict with the, again, like the goals or the dynamic sound and sonic qualities of like a lot of the Sudanese music. So I think it's been me like learning how to be like almost like a I don't know, like a baby gorilla audio engineer or something, and it's been interesting. And I think but yeah, there's always limitations. The tapes are limitations. The tape player is a limitation. Like just before I got here, my tape player like, you know, stopped working, and you know, I have to like now figure out where to source the parts from eBay because the tape player is from the 1980s, and you know, and then I have to like watch, you know, a YouTube tutorial on how to like replace the belts and kind of do that. So it's interesting, and obviously for me it's a generational thing too. I'm learning to use and work with music technology I didn't necessarily grow up with. You know, I grew up in the digital era, the, you know, Spotify era, MP3 era. So it's been interesting, but I'll pass it to Sada to talk more as well.
I'm really glad you brought up the MP3 and the politics of actually how you record as well. So you had in a lot of countries that had larger infrastructures around recordings, even in the analog period, there would be certain decades where there's a standard for the radio. And so you needed to mix and master your things to meet a certain kind of decibel level in it. That changes with every new platform that's invented. So like you mentioned with the MP3, since then, with the arrival of Spotify, for example, and iTunes, the decibels of mixing and mastering have also changed. So you can really start to then suss out what decade things are coming from based off on that and what region they're coming from. So the limitations of that are honestly in the hands of the person holding it, which is why it's so important to have a variety of people trying to do this instead of just one kind of person from one kind of place. And a problem that I also ran into in Sudan is that we do not have a sound engineering world. Like there's no study of sound. You know, you have people until today, that's our biggest problem. And the people who do study sound that are Sudanese end up going to work somewhere else, even before the war started. So that was always a major issue, I think, in our infrastructure in general. TV had its own thing and you could only do it live, but the mixing was just atrocious. And then when you take it and digitize it onto YouTube, a lot of the older stuff, the Amus didn't know what they were doing either. And so I don't know what's happening when they digitize things. You end up with a lot of peaks and lows. But again, a crux of that is that you can really trace the fact that when we were recording, we also didn't have good sound engineers. We also didn't have this, but yeah, there are limits to what you can do without a master, to be honest. You can try your best, but that's why it's important to have the master, because you could do more from there.
You have a question?
I wonder, do you stress? I feel stressed about the idea of like a purely digital archive of anything. And I just wonder how, you know, we're talking about the limitations of analog, but also, you know, what is it like? I think this is a challenge that institutions and individuals around the world are kind of facing, you know, creative professionals. What does it mean to sort of sustainably archive like creative output? And so I just wanted your observations or your reflections on the thought that like actually what is the, you know, if all, you know, goes to shit, as it were, and what is left is like binary, how do we recover that? What is our relationship with that?
That's an excellent question. And I think it's hard because I mean, you know, the digital seems maybe more the longevity aspect. I think this seems more reliable, right, than analog media. But I mean, again, I think like this is something that came up where it's like the digital realm, you know, these sites are not owned by, you know, I'm uploading these onto SoundCloud. They could one day come and, you know, take them all down. So there's that component. And then, you know, I think in my case, again, I'm working with, private collections. I'm not someone who, for example, has the resources to store, these kind of tapes in a certain way. I buy little like case, bags, for the tapes and to at least, store them in a semi-reasonable way. But there's like human error. Like sometimes I open them, my cat jumps on. It's like kind of like, this is not, I would not say an industry standard of like, storing the media. But I think that's a great question. And I think um yeah, it's hard. I mean, so many people right now in Sudan have probably parted with their collections, and like so many, it's all kind of in flux. And I think for me, what I know is digitizing and bringing things to the internet. And I think I'm a child of the internet and it seems reliable to me, but I know that yeah, the work is there's the physical component, there's the, preservation of the actual material in and of itself. But I think the easy thing is because these are private collections and belong to other folks, I'm kind of not the one making the decisions like about them. They kind of choose how they see fit. And but yeah, it's a really excellent question.
I just want to add that, sorry, yes, absolutely. I just want to add that I think it's really important to understand that nothing is permanent. Nothing. The cloud's not permanent. Analog is not permanent. We're not permanent. And so if you try to do the best you can store things the best you can, but part of living is realizing that you might lose everything. And that's just life.
I'm curious, there are two interrelated questions, and this notion of democratization of archiving, and when you factor in sort of the urgency or the feeling of urgency, the sense of urgency, what do you tell people in terms of if you want to archive, do you make your own archive on SoundCloud? Do you go to YouTube? Do you have people send music, to you, to either of you? How do you sort of scale democratization, given, this is kind of the second part of the question, how, for example, SoundCloud works, where it's really kind of set up for the artist or the single user to create an account, and it's sort of centralized. So I'm just wondering how democratization and how these cloud services, which are kind of set up around a single entity owning the account, how you handle those pieces.
Sorry, in the interest of time, I'm just going to add a question from the Zoom. I have a question. How do you see the political landscape of music affecting the archiving and collection of data in Sudan's current situation as it has historically? From your experience, how can we address the significant differences in Sudanese music? For example, there have been many comments online on online platforms discussing the Janjaweed playing Saharian or West African folk music in their TikTok videos, with people using this as a way to identify them. Could you please provide insights into this?
First, I just wanted to thank you because I think it's such a beautiful way of ending this conference. And in some ways, we've come, I think, full circle in terms of thinking about some of the narratives and the historical, the sort of historical amnesia, but narratives that we're trying to challenge. One of the things that, and this is maybe mostly to Alsarah, but when I was doing research in like rural parts of Sudan, I often thought about labor and music and the way that music is being used, like when people are, for example, working in the Kamain or, on the farm or whatever. And that is to me where I saw like the kind of microcosm of of Sudan in the center, right? Because of who was doing the labor in a way. And so I was wondering about that as an ethnomusicologist, like how do you source music? Like where do you go to find different kinds of music in order to challenge some of the canon, our kind of perception and narrative around what does and doesn't constitute Sudanese music?
That's a really good question. The best way is to go in person. That's the best way. The second best way is to ask someone to send it to you, but then you're depending on their vision of how they're looking at these people, how they're interacting with people, their position in the room. That the person gathering information is never neutral. And so it's always important to keep that in mind while you're gathering information. So honestly, the only realistic way I know is that way. After that, every other way is through an extra lens. You're putting in an extra lens ahead of it, so which is fine, because I think it's also important to, if you're going to be a cultural commentator, to see all the lenses, because the lenses are really also important in the political scene. For example, to go back to the question, to circle to the question online about the Janjaweed playing Sahara music, and that's what makes makes them identifiable. That's assuming that people in Darfur never listen to Hausa music or Sahara music, or that they're not also from there as well. And this is also a part of this whole, one of our biggest pitfalls as Sudanese people is that we are so quick to dismiss anything we don't know as not Sudanese. And that's not true, because we don't know anything about ourselves. And so the consumption of Hausa music 10, 15 years ago was by children. It's not by Janjaweed. Janjaweed are also not necessarily foreign to Sudan. This false narrative of it is part of that. And I grew up at a time when there was also no challenging of what it means to be Sudanese. Anyone who was from anywhere outside the peripheries of Khartoum became not Sudanese. And so the politics of how we are approaching this is, again, based on the amount of knowledge we have. And that's why I think I like to stress the fact that we don't know ourselves. And once we accept that truth about ourselves, we can then move forward towards building. To circle back to the question about the single-use platforms and how to move around that and what to do with it, I love YouTube. I do not have a Spotify account. I do not have an iTunes account. I think YouTube, because for me, was the first place I found Amu's uploading stuff. It had a much more egalitarian approach to how, like, the fact that all of a sudden an individual instead of an institution can put out music. That was really empowering to me as an artist growing up, as a musician, as an ethnomusicologist in training at the time, to know that you can have a part of this kind of agency and this kind of movement and this kind of work. So I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing, the single user platform. It's not necessarily a good thing. It's a tool like any tool. It depends on how we want to wield it.
And I'll add to the question about, I think, the single platform. I mean, for me, I encourage people that I know, again, within my very specific community to, donate tapes, and, I will do the labor. But I think for me, the function of getting folks to see themselves as archivists, I mean, even if you're just creating a family archive that lives for you only and is on a flash drive that you own. I think, again, this for me goes back to the component of this work as, again, it's an affective process, it's emotional, it's based in sentiment. And I think a big driving force, for this work and what helped me reckon with the value of the work is really people who just message me and say, like, I showed this archive to my father and I saw him be joyful for the first time in a long time, and for, folks who say, this tape reminds me of my late grandmother. She used to listen to this tape. And I've encountered it even, with my own family. I think there was a tape I was digitizing. It was a Madih tape. It was Awlad al-Bur'i. Misr al-Mu'ammana. And, it's a classic tape. And, my grandmother loved that tape. And she used to have a portable radio player and she would play it, in the morning when she was making breakfast. And I was digitizing it, I was in the room and my mother was in the living room and I came out and she was, teary-eyed. She was like, I remembered my mother and I remembered that moment. So I think even if, maybe I'm not able to replicate the work of a large scale institution or an archival institution, right? And obviously the internet itself is not, again, it's not permanent, and at some point SoundCloud could cease to exist, and I'm aware of that. And I think what you said, you might lose everything. But I think for me, again, the emotional, the psychic process for me is equally important. If it just means that somebody can listen to a song that they haven't heard in a very, very, very long time in a car with their kids, that's enough for me personally. So yeah.
Wow. Thank you guys so much for just a beautiful way to close. And, like Nisreen said, I think that you guys hit the head on so many of the things that we've talked about over the past 2 days. But I think you've also, so Nisreen, not to put you on the spot, but Nisreen gave a really beautiful talk at NYU a few days ago, and she ended her presentation with this focus on life. And although that wasn't the intention here, I feel like you guys brought us back to that, just like a remembrance of what it is that we're trying to remember, what it is that we're trying to hold on to. And it's just made me feel really good. And thank you. I really appreciate that. And with that, we have to close this conference, and I'm so overwhelmed by everything that's happened in the past 2 days. And I wish we could go on and on and on, because it's just been so enriching. And it also just feels so full circle in many ways. Like, again, not to put you all on the spot, but I met Nasreen a few years ago, and like way before, when I applied to PhD programs, and we did a conference at NYU in 2019. A few days after the sit-in happened, and we had a very different conversation. I met Khulud 2 years ago when I moved to Sudan, and amongst this like very smart, funny, witty group of like Sudanese scholars and feminists and activists. And I feel like I've been watching Yasmin on TV for so long, and been like just emboldened by how you've defended us and spoken for us for all these years. Alsarah, I've seen you perform in 3 continents. I don't know if you remember, but I saw you in London in 2017, and then in Egypt, and then in Flatbush. And you were my first introduction to as a lover of music, you gave me a sense of ownership of over a Sudanese sound. And I remember blasting your album, and I was interning somewhere, and the girl next to me was like, "Can you please, it can't every day be blasting the music." Not every day, but I persisted, and she didn't really like me that much, but it was fine. And Haneen with Vintage Sudan, I remember following your page on Tumblr when I was 15, and literally the desktop background of my computer for the past 10 years has been one of the photos that I found there. And so this has just been so full circle in many ways. And also I came across the work of Sudan Human Rights Hub a few months ago, and I was feeling really dejected about just what to do with studying the past and being so consumed by it when things were falling apart in front of our very eyes. So to find a group of people that were dedicated and resourceful and innovative and talented, who were putting all of this effort to innovate a platform to preserve a memory that was important and painful and difficult, was it definitely changed the trajectory of how I thought of the nature of my own work. And all of these threads have come so beautifully together to in these past 2 days. And I really thank you all for your contributions, for bearing with us these past few months, over all the emails and the Zoom calls and the WhatsApp groups. And again, thank you to Dan and Christy for bearing with my co-conveners and I, and all of our ambitions and putting this together. Thank you to Lavuyo and to Jordan for making this all possible, and for inviting me to Brown. I don't know if anybody knows, but I don't go here. I actually I don't go here. Yeah, this is my first time on this campus. I go to Yale. Yeah, I don't go here. Yeah, I mean, if you want. So yeah, thank you all so much for your generous contributions. I want to say, for those of you who are able to support the mutual aid networks that are currently helping and doing life-saving, revolutionary work in Sudan, you can donate to sudansolidarity.com or sunduqsudan.org. Both of the links are sent in the chat, and we'll be emailing all of the participants who signed up, virtual and in person, these links, as well as just other resources and details. And with that,
massive thank you, of course, to Bayan.
Thank you.